Welcome to the U.S. Chamber of Cannabis podcast. I'm your host, Scott Goddard. I go by the Professor or Professor Scott. And thanks for joining me today, everybody. Now, in this episode, we have an incredible guest lined up on the show, especially incredible if you're curious about starting a small to medium-sized cannabis business anytime soon. So let me take a moment to introduce the winner of the 2019 Ernst & Young's Entrepreneur of the Year Award for San Diego, a finalist for 5 years running for the title of Most Admired CEO by San Diego Business Journal, and voted one of the 500 most influential business leaders from 2016 to 2021. A large warm welcome for the CEO of FundCanna, Adam Stettner, to the show. Thanks for joining me today, Adam.
Thank you very much for having me.
I appreciate you having the time. Now, before we get into the main interview, we like to run a small segment called the High Five. We like to call 5 quick questions concerning cannabis. And so if you're ready, Adam, I'll shoot right into it.
Let it rip.
Right on. So what is one of your favorite things about cannabis?
I'll say the way it brings people together. The ability for the plant to not only treat pain and other disorders, but anxiety, sleeplessness, et cetera. And then, of course, the social benefits are amazing as well. It's I don't think you've really laughed if you haven't laughed as hard as I have while using cannabis.
That's a good point. I saw something recently that said, although it wasn't obliquely put, at one point somebody walked in on Benjamin Franklin and a woman in a bath, eye out of their minds, in the very same thought, laughing harder than anybody really enjoys themselves in the best way possible. So yeah. I like that. It's a great answer. For number 2, you've certainly consumed cannabis. What's your favorite way to consume?
Well, first, I just want to say that I've used it for all the ways that I mentioned. So I've used it to help me with sleep, to help me with anxiety, topically to help with pain, shoulder pain in particular, and found it to be amazing. But my favorite way to consume is edibles, and in particular gummies. And I like gummies that are strain specific because for me, I know which strains I enjoy most. And with a gummy, especially, and I only recommend legal consumption, but when you consume a gummy and you know not only the strain, but how many milligrams you're getting, you can get predictable and repeatable results. And for me, until trying edibles, I never had that kind of predictability before.
Yeah, variability is a big thing with cannabis. Sometimes it is different moment to moment, but I agree. This actually for me is an edibles year as well. So it's a good theme, I think, to keep going, especially. What was your first experience with cannabis like? Was it more so positive, you would say, or more so negative, given, possible paranoia and anxiety, or, prohibition status at the point in time?
Sure. Well, it was definitely positive. And it was positive because of the anxiety I mentioned earlier. I was a freshman at a large university and very anxious. I'm not much of a drinker. And I found cannabis really helped me not only bond with what became my close friends, but it brought the anxiety down to a level where I could interact comfortably with others and just have a great time.
Awesome. And for the last of the high five, thinking about the future of cannabis a little bit, do you think that the overall business structure nationally with cannabis in America will mimic like tobacco or alcohol in the way there's sort of 4 or 5 big companies and then a lot of small fill-ins? Or do you think that we might see something really unique given how strange cannabis has been on its journey so far?
Probably a mix of both. It's a tough question to answer, but I think the distribution model seems to lend itself to the alcohol distribution model. And undoubtedly the beverage market, you've seen insane consolidation in the alcohol industry. So I can see some of that rolling over, but I do think the unique nature of cannabis, not only as an industry, but also as a culture, will create the fringe around that core that will likely be unique.
Right on. Yeah, I've talked to a couple of folks. We're sort of all on that platform pre-transition whenever federal prohibition finally ends, and it is a head scratcher. I've heard some folks say they really think it's going to be an improvement given the efficiencies of a national model, but there's some folks who say like, well, we lose more than we gain, and certainly since you're sort of in that small to mid-sized lending side of it, I thought a great question to transition into our main interview. So there's a lot of folks in the audience that may not have heard of FundCanna at this point. So I wanted to know if you might give us a rundown of what your venture is all about and what you're trying to accomplish, since it is such a unique market and unique times to be involved.
Of course. Well, for the past 20 years, I've been involved in creating or designing financial product that, in the way I describe it, serves the underserved. And that's really to say every market has segments that are underserved by traditional financial institutions. So I come from both consumer and commercial funding, lending, um, and um, and so I did student loans, and there and you hear a lot in the headlines about student lending, but I put out about 14 billion on my balance sheet in student loans. But I did it because we designed not only the product but the interaction with the company to be one where you didn't feel like you were just a number or just part of the masses, because I believe people are not part of the masses. They're their own unique individual with their own story. And getting money, regardless of what it's for, is very stressful. And I'm going to directly tie this in to your question. But I transitioned from consumer student loans when the recession struck in 2008. Uh, Everybody, all the banks were in disarray, and I lost my credit facility. And I realized that after 14 billion working and partnering with banks, and in essence lending to borrowers that they were not lending to, but they were working with me as conduit. If I was getting cut off during the recession with all that history, what was small business going to do? And the answer is, even in a good economy, small business struggles. Non-cannabis small business struggles in accessing capital. So I started a small business lender. I ran that for 14 years. We had offices on both coasts and put out about $3 billion and underwrote over 1 million files. And then I realized during the pandemic that cannabis was even more underserved, in the sense that 15,000 banks servicing small business, only 500 to 700 of those service cannabis as deposit institutions, and almost none of them will lend into cannabis. And so FundCanna was founded with the intent of understanding the supply chain and the ancillary markets that service that supply chain, plant touching and otherwise, THC or hemp, and designing financial product that facilitated growth and ease the burden of cash outlay and the down period until that cash outlay creates revenue. So FundCanna is in essence a short-term funding source for the cannabis industry to either fuel growth or to be used as a backstop for vendor payment and the like.
All right, on. So it can actually be functional capital in that moment or primary investment as you get built together, which I think, especially knowing the banking situation federally, is very important at this stage in cannabis, as a lot of folks are interested. And you did mention, obviously, you have a unique approach to the side of business. Would you say it's easier to just do it as numbers as opposed to passion, given the billions of dollars involved? It sounds like it's easier to use a calculator than your heart to make decisions in that mode.
It is, but but I think that the right way to approach this is a combination of both. So there are ways to build algorithms and automate and underwrite risk, and then augment that process with the story that a cannabis operator has. So the one thing I want to say is we will not fund pre-revenue business. And in large part, I want to make sure I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I encourage entrepreneurial spirit. So it's not that I'm anti startup, I am startup, but myself. but it's very hard for me to be a great partner to someone that doesn't yet have any data points, because I don't know if I'm sizing the burden of debt service properly if there isn't yet a record of inflow and outflow of cash for me to look at. So from that respect, data dictates size, but term and all the nuance or detail around what we do, how we do it, and how we work with our clients, that gets filled in by the story. So to answer your question more directly, I would say we utilize both. As you put it, you put heart and passion. I would say we're a combination of data, automation, and then story and manual process to augment that automation. And those things together not only create scale and speed, but they also enable us to modify what would otherwise be a box. I don't want to live in a box, and I don't want to put people in a box. And so the idea here is use data and automation to make large decisions, and then use the story and the detail to nuance around those decisions. And hopefully that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. It actually makes me think a lot about the timing of that transition going from school loans to cannabis. Do you feel that being involved with student lending gave you a good preparation for some of the volatility and kind of strangeness of this market, given the timing towards '08? Or do you feel like you're really operating with an understanding of funding now that's starkly different or hard to apply in other areas?
It's a great question, and the honest answer is I'm always learning, and I'm not sure if I've ever figured out what I'm trying to figure out, even after doing it for a decade or more, or on paper looking like the efforts that have been made have been successful monetarily or otherwise. I feel like there's always a lot I don't know, and there's always a lot more for me to learn. So I've learned a lot in the journey to get where I am sitting here talking to you today. And I call on all of it to shape the decisions I make in the days that lay ahead of me. But my eyes are wide open, my ears are wide open, and I'm paying attention. And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, 6 months from now, I'm going to be stronger than I am as I sit here and speak with you today. I'm already stronger than I was 6 months ago. And so I think if you keep an open mind and you don't have the answers, then the answers come to you. And so that's the approach I take. But undoubtedly, I call on recessions of the past, and the ups and downs that I've had in other portfolio businesses and outside of lending, to help me shape not only product, but our approach.
So it seems like a central feature to what you're especially expressing here is sort of being able to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. I think a lot of folks might intuit hearing the values that you've managed before, and also your ability to transition between two different markets, although similar in their funding. That there's a lot of people who want to do similar ventures, but probably feel that same trigger of fear when they're dealing with risk management and risk calculation. I heard you on a previous interview on the Green Rush, and you talked quite a bit about factoring risk versus calculated risks. So do you feel that it's something that is more intuitive for you, or is it something that, as you kind of mentioned, over time, as you were constantly sort of in the student mentality of learning it, you just remained that mentality? I think a lot of folks probably think billion dollars worth of movement, that guy probably sits back and knows exactly what to do. So what's more of a realistic understanding of exactly how that is with risk assessment?
So first, I really appreciate the way that is framed. I'm going to be very candid. I always am. Sometimes I think people wish I wasn't, but I'm a very anxious person. I've always been very anxious, and the way I've gotten comfortable is really time and doing it. And I didn't start at $1 billion. It's kind of like if a fighter pilot started in an F-18 instead of in a Cessna, that would be terrifying. But by the time he gets to the F-18 or she, it's not terrifying, because they've done the training and they've gone from maybe flying at 150 knots to flying at the speed of sound gradually over a period of time. And so I don't want to mislead anyone and make it seem like I'm comfortable and I'm smart and I can handle anything. No, I've been hit in the face and the stomach and everywhere else you can imagine, making mistakes along the way, but the original mistakes were at a very small scale. And and then I became comfortable at that level and then evolved to the next level. You mentioned, in essence, and I'm paraphrasing, being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And I would tell you, my my approach, and this is by no way intended to be condescending. It's the opposite to anyone that's listening. Because I'm anxious, I have a desire to grow and to not make mistakes over and over and over again, the same mistakes. And so when you combine that anxiety can do one of two things. It either makes you more aware, but pushes you forward, or it causes you to kind of stay where you are because you're scared of either what you don't know or screwing up. And I'm more scared of staying where I am than I am of being uncomfortable. And so I've become, as you put it, very comfortable being uncomfortable because I know I can't grow unless I'm uncomfortable. So whenever I feel comfortable, it turns into feeling complacent, and then I start to panic. My anxiety gets very high. As long as I feel this sense of discomfort, and there are ranges of everything. I don't want to be freaking out, Scott, right?
Right.
But I do want to always feel like I'm close to the edge. And and I say close. I don't want to be right at the edge, but I want to be close to the edge because then I know I'm increasingly getting more and more comfortable with the growth that comes from being at the edge. If I stand in the middle of the room and not near the edge of the room, the edge being, let's say, on the ledge of a cliff,
Right.
I don't even know what it looks like to look down. I want to know what it feels like to keep pushing. And eventually that room gets bigger and bigger. And that answers your question about becoming more and more comfortable. The more you push yourself, the more uncomfortable you are, the more you discover what you're capable of. If you always do what feels comfortable, you never really know what your competencies are. And I'm terrified of not learning what I can do. I'm a little less fearful of finding out what I don't do well. And trust me, there are plenty of things, and I found a bunch of them.
I like that. I like that quite a bit. I do, outside of obviously cannabis, I think it's cerebrally such a gifted thing to consume because it can recontextualize things, as you mentioned, like anxiety. I consider anxiety to be sort of like a superpower on its own, but it rarely shows up when you can use that power. It gives you almost like a permanent memory of what happens. It gives you a level of energy, which is usually more threatening than it is able to be tamed. But in that same way, if you can move it into the right lane, it can blow by everything that's standing still, but usually it arrives more so making you leave that lane, right? And taking a person out of their character.
Yeah,
And
very,
so
very, very well said. If I can just add, I really
please do,
appreciate
please
the
do.
way you just framed that. I think using your analogy of moving lanes, that idea, instead of being wanting to stay in the lane, if you let the anxiety take you to new places, in other words, it's fuel, right? Like you
Hmm.
mentioned, it can make you move quickly. It does often show up at the wrong time, but if you can learn not to be scared of the anxiety and instead embrace it and harness it. It's kind of like having rocket fuel on tap, and and then as you become accustomed to making decisions under duress, it becomes more normalized, and all of a sudden your new level is not anxiety inducing. Your new level is your new normal, but you were brought there by your anxiety, and then the next time it shows up, you're almost excited to see where it will take you.
Yeah. I think there's almost a moment, or it's hard to feel more alive than in an anxious moment, because in some ways it's like every sense turns on beyond what is able to be absorbed. Maybe I can take 100%, but that's like 20% of every sense. But if I
Right.
have one of those senses, right, go into that super session, that over 100%, it's like brain can't process quick enough. Things start to move quicker than maybe the science of management would prescribe.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
I think then a lot of times it's, the bull's bucking you off instead of you being able to be confident. But I always consider in the same respect, it's only a mistake if you repeat it. It's a lesson. You're never really supposed to get the lesson the first time you get it. It's like a
That's right.
weird test, but
Yeah.
getting back on the bull, right? Being willing at the very least to reassess, I think shows a lot in not only the way that you've approached business, but I think what cannabis requires in this. Thinking down that lane, because I know I feel, I guess, similar to you, at least in some aspect of being early. Because I would say that there's probably a lot of folks like you who do want to get into cannabis, maybe on just the business element, not thinking more so with their heart. But the law says I shouldn't. Maybe I'm not going to try anything new. In your experience up to this point in FundCanna, have you run into something that was just glaringly like a wall that you couldn't pass? I know sometimes social media does that, where you can't promote or present yourself in an honest way. Has there been any like rough lessons in the early days of FundCanna?
No rough lessons. I think there have been a lot of lessons about how illogical some of the structures or the laws are, and those have been tough for someone that is mostly left brain, mostly logic driven. When something is so illogical, and then you watch those uh, behaviors be repeated at scale over and over again, um, it's difficult because we all have to operate within that framework. I will only operate with legal, we only fund legal operators that
Mm-hmm.
are already producing revenue. And so in that regard, watching how constrained they are by something that is so illogical has been very frustrating for us. But we haven't, and originally both financial licensing entities were licensed as a lender. We're not licensed in cannabis. I am not plant touching.
Right.
But I service both plant touching and non-plant touching entities. So we got licensed as a lender, and then some banks did, and that was difficult because what do you do? And then explaining it was unique. Let's put it that way. But then with banking, regular banks don't want to bank what we do, and cannabis banks know what to do. Again, I mentioned roughly 700 of them now. They know what to do with plant touching entities. They weren't sure what to do with a financial services company that serviced those plant touching entities. So even getting a bank account took us longer than it would have taken had we been a cultivator or a manufacturer that was plant touching, because it wasn't just the diligence of being a legal entity. It was then we're moving money. So now we get into anti-money laundering, knowing our customers, bank secrecy acts, FinCEN guidance. And there was this whole other layer of finance in cannabis that kind of threw a curveball at us. So in that regard, I wouldn't say there were major potholes or anything that was shocking, but it's been difficult to get going, which again gives me the ability to not only empathize, relate, but want to hear more about the stories so that we can evolve the product to service, because all of our clients have been through the same kind of grinder.
Yeah, it is seemingly ubiquitous, even if you tip your toes in a little bit. Now, I founded the U.S. Chamber a little while ago to sort of congregate businesses so that we can build a community, because I agree with you in the idea that community really kind of is the outcome that all of this action should move towards, like groupings, and especially what I'm glad to hear from you going through 2008 and knowing that you were in a position at that point where obviously a lot was changing in the businesses you were involved in. A lot of businesses went towards investment capital in non-local entities. I think a lot of the larger banks went towards just stock trading at that point and doing a lot of the housing market manipulation that we're kind of currently in the midst of. So I'm really glad to especially hear that you were thinking in the same way that I think traditional banking was, which is invest in businesses so they can grow in the country, and you sort of have a great feedback loop. So thinking of some of the folks that are either involved with these businesses or maybe passionate and want to get into it, but have been scared about funding, what's some of the headspace that you might be able to express that these companies might want to embrace as they think about growth or think about even acquiring funding as a smaller business? Obviously, it's not just, I want to take over the world with cannabis. They have to be solvent to some extent at this point. But is there anything else that, from your vantage point, that is better information or a better tactic to think about in growing a cannabis business or finding lending?
Yes. Well, there are a couple of things here. First is, in terms of accessing capital, they're two primary, aside from creating revenue, right? They're two
Right.
primary sources. One is equity and the other is debt. And they both have their place, and they're both excellent when applied properly. And I think that when applied properly is a very important um, qualifier. But so I think equity is great when you're first starting out and you don't yet have revenue, as long as you're not over raising. You don't want to raise too much money, because you end up giving equity away in the business, just as the word says, and you don't get it back. So you want that equity to be strategic. So in my mind, equity has its place. I've used equity in every business I've started, and that's only three. It's three businesses, but each of them has had equity, and all three have had debt. And so a combination of the two, I think, are the ultimate. You should not fuel your business with equity. You should fuel it with debt, because no matter what that debt costs, it's less expensive than giving away a chunk of your business that you can never get back. So, so that's one thing to think about. And then the other is, I think, as you prepare, whether it's for equity or debt, I think in some regard, and it can be self-deprecating humor if we apply it right, but it really is how I think. I often try to boil it down to make it as simple as possible. So I think like an 8-year-old kid. I ask the WH questions. What am I trying to achieve? And what obstacles might I hit? The what, the why, the when, the how, and all of those questions. How am I going to get there? When do I believe I'll be in a position to raise the money? How will I go about getting it? How will I go about repaying it if it's debt? And how will I feel if I give piece of my business away that is outsized on the equity side and can't ever get it back? So all of those questions, as you're forming a business, I always challenge myself to think that through. What makes me think I'll be able to do this? How am I different from others, right? All of those things, they really put you in a position, even if it seems like a ministerial exercise, it puts you in the mindset where you've gone through this cycle, and then but inevitably potential equity investors, they're going to ask you questions that might align. Now, they may ask them more like a 40-year-old banker or a 50-year-old banker than an 8-year-old child. But I like to think of it in the simplistic sense, because it gives me a true way to think it through in my own head, and then I'm presentation ready. And so I would consider equity and debt, or equity versus debt, and the pros and the cons of each, and then go through those WH questions, and really write the questions down. Don't think of the question and only come up with the answer. Part of the joy for me is writing all the questions that I want to ruminate on, and then taking the time to come up with the answers to those questions, even if I don't like the answers. It's an honest way to assess what the best path is. And then that will lead you to, should I be pursuing the equity or should I be pursuing debt? And if so, how much? And then ultimately, if you work with a reputable equity and strategic equity investor or debt provider like FundCanna, we work with the clients to determine what the repayment burden looks like or feels like. And it should, although I use the word burden, it should never feel like a burden if it's sized properly. It should feel like something that propels the business forward.
Wow, well said. Well said. I think with a lot of the businesses that I've spoken with, of course, the idea always takes center stage and like the elevator pitch. But I would say it is very attractive. Kind of keep it simple when you start so that you can have the clarity. Certainly, I think there's a lot of complexity to the market. So it's kind of, I'd say, refreshing to hear somebody involved at your level to say, like, you can still kind of start the way that even the more elementary approach prescribes, just being able to get your ducks in a row and get your head straight, because obviously there's going to be a lot more complex things to have to navigate. And if you don't keep that focus, I think people get lost in it, especially. Does tax code 280E Do you feel that that's a major roadblock in either how you function or what's preventing you from being able to move forward? Like, do you talk about it daily, weekly, or monthly at all, or is that just sort of, there's always a regulation in the way?
No, it's the former, not the latter.
Mm.
For me, 280E is a big one, like a very big issue for the industry. So I think about it often. I talk about it every chance I get. And the reason I'll say I talk about it often is, although I don't have a loud voice, I don't have a megaphone. Um, I think collectively all of our voices, even if they're murmurs at the moment, when they all come together, they get a lot louder. And politics or legislators, they listen to only a couple of things. They listen to numbers, and by that I'll get to money.
Hmm.
I just mean sheer volume of feedback, because they're elected and they want to be reelected, and they get elected through votes. And so if all the people that are voting are making a lot of noise, they have to listen. And then money. And I think 280 plays a role in both areas, and that's why I make a lot of noise. Um, so my concern regarding 280, first, I think it's one of the biggest issues the industry faces. I won't say the biggest, but it's one of the biggest. And the reason I say that is I can't think of another industry where the effective tax rate is 70%. And
It's ridiculous.
that's not to even speak to what the consumer has to pay in sales and excise and other taxes. Um, but it's really just for the industry. The industry has an effective tax rate of roughly 70%. Uh, all other industries can write off their cost of goods sold. You'll often see that listed as COGS,
Yeah, the cogs.
right? So and this industry cannot. And they can't because 280E in the tax code basically says if you derive revenue, even from what we deem to be an illegal activity, you must pay taxes on that revenue. However, unlike other business where there is a cost to create that revenue, because the federal illegal nature or the prohibited nature of our industry says you're not allowed to do this, they don't allow you to write off the cost of goods to create the revenue. So you have a company that produces widgets, whatever it costs to create those widgets, that manufacturer outside of cannabis can write off all those costs, labor, raw materials, you name it, right? And cost of sales, et cetera. And then they may sell $100,000 worth of materials, but their cost might have been 50,000. They're only going to pay tax on the delta. And for cannabis, in that same example, 100,000 of sales, 50,000 worth of raw materials or costs, they're paying tax because of 280E on all 100,000. And that in effect increases the tax rate dramatically over a normal operating business. And then what that does is trickle down. Not only does it compress margins, but it forces, first, it's not affordable, it's not sustainable. And it forces cannabis operators to raise prices, which begets more taxation.
Hmm.
But then it also drives consumers or operators that want to be compliant with the law uh, to be illicit operators or customers purchasing from the illicit market, because the barrier to entry is so much lower, the costs are so much lower, and they are not having to be compliant with all the laws, including the exorbitant and egregious tax rates. So that's why you see, I'll use California as an example.
Hmm.
California is a $3 billion annual market legally. It is a $12 billion annual market all in. And so 75%, $9 billion, is moved through the illicit market. Now I go back to the politics of this, noise and money. If we're only collecting taxes from 3 billion, but there's 12 billion in activity taking place, and overtaxation is one of the many reasons why so many operators operate illicitly. there is absolutely a model that shows that the potential for recovery on tax dollars, whether it's at the state or municipal level or the federal level, the opportunity to collect is greater if you have a bigger share of the market at a lower rate. And I think that is something that I don't want to. Politicians, they have a job to do, but sometimes because they're not in an industry, they don't fully understand. They make a law without a comprehensive understanding of the impact of that legislation. So I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not mocking in any way, shape, or form. I'm only saying there is a significantly better way to structure how cannabis is viewed by the federal government, both in terms of how it's scheduled, which is not part of 280E, of course, but also the way it's taxed. Even if it remained federally illegal, changing 280E or the laws around taxation would make a huge difference. I will say the biggest difference would be if it was federally accepted, federally legal, and descheduled. I think that's the biggest, because then that opens interstate commerce, it opens marketing, it opens some of the other things you've mentioned, and removes the prohibition that causes 280. Hopefully I didn't go too far off on a tangent there.
No, that's exactly what I wanted to hear about, actually. For those in the audience who, I think if you listen to this kind of podcast, I've spoken to 280E at length as well, because of the heavy frustrations in just the structure of it. And it's preventative in a way that it wasn't intended to, as you mentioned, because it kind of limits the ability to even understand the taxes you're not being able to actually collect due to almost like a short-sighted nature of the market, and what I would consider even like more of a gut punch reaction to just the idea of the word illicit versus the functionality of one market against. In my mind, especially having been involved with cannabis longer than the laws have, it's like, you know how big the market is, but the people who govern it can only see a portion of it, like what's been litigated against and maybe the imprisonment side of it, and then what has obviously been above the counter in that way, what is actually legal at the current time. And so they govern based off of like a peeking through a door as opposed to seeing exactly what's going on behind it. I've worked for a couple cannabis companies, and I wouldn't say it's a short-sightedness, because again, you can't completely trust unknowns, but it does seem like it's a borrowed behavior from the practice of other markets. Like, oh, this will just be like the other ones. It's like, I kind of feel like the uniqueness of this market is what determines the success more than its ease of repeatability or mimicry of other markets, especially.
Yeah, well, all of that is great insight and spoken clearly from somebody that's been around it for a while and has a comprehensive understanding. And I think that's the thing, Scott, that we in the industry need to bridge, is the understanding for people that aren't in the industry. And the simplest example I give is, if currently the government's collecting, just arbitrarily, two people do $100 in sales and they collect, just to make our lives easy, $50 from each. They're collecting $100, the government. But if there are 10 people doing $100 each and they collect $12 from each person, they're collecting $120. Their collection would go up by 20%. And operators have more capital to throw into and fuel the growth of their business, to employ more people who then pay payroll tax and sales tax and fuel the economy. And so cannabis is not a small economy in itself, somewhere between, let's say, legally $25 and $30 billion. Well, if 75% of the market in California is illicit, we're well into the north of $100 billion market, even if we didn't capture all of the illicit activity. And if it was properly taxed, undoubtedly more money would flow. But instead, and I have to say it because this is an area around 280, safe banking gets all the attention from legislators. But this industry, if you want to be banked, now cost of banking is an issue, and it's getting better because there aren't enough choices. But we do have 700 banks to choose from. Traditional business has 15,000. Nonetheless, we have roughly 5% of that. If you want to be banked, you can get a large money center bank, a regional bank, a credit union, an EO bank. They're all available. You can have armored car pickups. You don't have to walk around with duffel bags of money. Yet safe banking is getting all the attention from our legislators. If safe banking passes, it doesn't bring in the likes of B of A and JP Morgan and others, and it doesn't bring Visa, MasterCard. because it's still, or Amex, it's still federally illegal. And so I think what makes the difference are things like 280E or descheduling the drug or just making it legal. You've got over 40 states that have voted to make it legal. And so I think the attention, safe banking is so innocuous that it's easy for legislators to take it up, but it doesn't really advance the cause for the industry. What it does, it gives us attention and it creates momentum. And so in that regard, I welcome it. I just wish that there was something of substance being taken up by our legislators that would move the needle for the industry.
Yeah, well said. With the recent election cycle of the past year, November, me being based out of Pennsylvania, we at least had our one, John Fetterman, who's been very vocal about really kind of going for the throat of the idea of just saying straight legalize, knowing that there's probably going to be, 2 or 3 sort of diet steps before you actually fully reach Fed. But for a business like yours, let's say, for some reason next week on Monday, they said we're going to move it on schedules or legalize. For somebody who's involved with funding, does that mean scaling upwards, or does that mean for you now you get more emails than you'll ever see before because so many people are just going to engage with whatever idea they have because they've sort of been waiting for the risk to be mitigated through legalization as opposed to through clever thinking? Do you think
Sure.
it's a curse of more like too busy, or are you then aiming for large businesses, I guess is an easy way to ask it?
Yeah, well, I would never say I'm only aiming for large businesses. I can service large business now, but really the fabric of this country is small and medium business. I service small and medium business, and by small and medium, that's millions of dollars.
Oh yeah, yeah. We're
It's
not
not
talking one
nonprofit.
location, right? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. It's not, when sometimes when people say small business, they think of an eBay reseller working out of their garage, which by the way, nothing wrong with it at all, and can be a great business. But there's small businesses that do 25 million to 50 million annually. They're still not large MSOs in our world. So we service all the businesses, but I will never take my eye off the small to medium sized businesses. That is what I understand, and it's what I want to service. But I think legalization is a good thing for everyone, FundCanna included. It's good for a lot of reasons. Aside from normalization, the ability to market, sales will go up because now you've got interstate commerce. You've got the ability to market online. Google will not let you do that now. So there are a lot of things that come out of that, all of which will increase revenue and collaboration for the industry. It's very hard, other than brand deals, to cross state lines right now, unless you're an MSO. So all of that, I think, is of great help. And then I don't view banks as competitors. I view them as allies. And so as more banks come into the space, I don't want anyone to think I'm against safe banking because I don't want banks. I want all the banks. I just came out of small business lending where banks were my partners. My credit facilities were from banks, and that is legal for them to do all they want. But they only approve 20 to 25%. And in cannabis, it would be unreasonable to think that they're going to approve more. So there will always be a gap that banks don't fill. They're great at what they do, but they're not great at everything. None of us are. So I'm all for legalization. I think it makes things a lot easier. I think it brings costs down dramatically. It does increase competition. I think that's healthy. You need to stand on the quality of service, product, and reputation. And I think that when legalization comes, it'll be a great day, not only for FundCanna, but for everybody in the space.
Uh, now thinking in that same way, sort of future of cannabis, I guess, as a general thought process. Um, from an international perspective, have you had any specific countries that you've seen kind of model in a way where you're like, this is an attractive way to approach legalization? I know Thailand recently just kind of cut the cord, I think, rather aggressively and went full national legal from what used to be a pretty stiff sentence if you were caught with cannabis there or traveling to there. Do you feel that in that same pacing, you'd love to see the expansion, not only in your own business, but going international for a lot of these companies? Or is there something big in between here and there to think about otherwise, would you say?
From my perspective, I think I'm here and I service the United States. And our system is very broken and has a ton of opportunity to improve and grow and stabilize. And so from my perspective, for me, I'm not saying for the industry, I think, look, globally, the more accepted cannabis becomes on a global basis, the better for everyone, and in particular for the United States. For me personally, and for FundCanna, there's so much for us to do in the U.S. that I'm not even looking to the north, in the sense that, if a Canadian entity has U.S. presence, great, we can work with them. But I won't, if you're only in Canada. I'm not going outside of the United States. I haven't even come close to what I feel we need to do for the industry here, where I don't want to see something shiny, and it is exciting, but I don't want to see something shiny elsewhere and divert my attention from learning, studying, and servicing the industry here the way it needs to be serviced.
All right. So it almost sounds like a business discipline in a way, because I think a lot of folks, the way you see markets nowadays, and considering MSOs and sort of, I guess, investor-driven companies, especially when the shareholders seem to kind of direct the ship, it does seem to go towards like wherever shiny, right? And I think Peloton was a great case study in that lesson of being an opportunist, but also not necessarily trimming the hedges at the appropriate time to make it actually an opportunistic execution. When you're approaching business, and this kind of ties into maybe one or two of the last questions I have for you, how important is discipline, as you mentioned, like even just in a moment of ambient thought, not focusing on it? Would you say that as a factor, in folks who pursue business or want to see a level of defined success, that like knowing why and keeping that discipline is one of the major factors, as opposed to just being good at math or having an opportunity in front of you with good timing?
Well, I think the other two, being good at math and having good timing, they matter. I don't want to act like they don't matter, at least for me, in what I do. But I think discipline, you strike a chord that I try to play all the time, which I watch other people. I like to observe, as much to learn from them as to what I might want to emulate, but also things that I don't like, that I don't want to do, right? I can learn as much from others or more than I can learn from myself, good and bad. And discipline is critical. I feel there's so many people that I've watched that are smarter than I am, but they spread themselves very thin. There's an author I read, and I can't recall his name at the moment, but he referred to it at like executive leadership level as peanut buttering, right? Of just spreading himself around. And instead of doing it on one piece of bread, laying the whole loaf out and spreading peanut butter across the whole thing. And really, you just want to focus on your area and become excellent at that before you start to look at the other pieces of bread. And so I felt like that already before I read it. I just think he articulated it in a way that was easily explained. So yes, discipline has been critical for me. In student loans, I only focused on specific areas of lending there and through specific distribution channels. And then in small business funding, same, right? I had very targeted, not only product and demographic, but we didn't really take on other things. I didn't do insurance or payroll or HR or taxes, even though everybody we talked to had a need for those things. I wanted to be the expert, the best experience with the best solutions for the topic they were calling about. And in cannabis, I want to be the same. All business needs capital, and it's just a question of when. It's never a question of if. And so I want to make sure that I am constantly evolving and studying supply chain and the needs for ancillary and the direct supply chain. Studying those needs and then only designing the products that my client base or prospective client base not only needs, but is delivered to them in the way they want it delivered. It's got to work for them. And if it doesn't work for them in the long run, it's not going to work for me. I feel like if I look at the shiny objects,
Mhm.
there's no way I can deliver an amazing experience on the one. So I see it often too. I think once you reach a certain scale, I want to be clear, like you look at Amazon, they do everything,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But they didn't start that way, right? It was Jeff Bezos in his garage with knee pads, packing books, on the floor. And it was books, books, books. And then it turned into everything that it is now. Now, I'm not saying FundCanna will ever be an Amazon. I'm on the floor with knee pads packing books, and that is my books is debt finance for the cannabis space.
So I think when people hear, and it's very encouraging, I'd say, because as opposed to assuming that born, briefcase, tie, ready to go, it's really a process of constant development. Now, when I listened to another podcast you were a guest on, you mentioned motorsports, and I have to ask because I also suffer from a love of mechanical things all over the place, especially in cars. Uh, for what you're able to do in understanding risk, discipline, and the ability to execute in business, you had a great diatribe about exactly how that kind of formulates into personal areas and how that sort of drives even hobbycraft. Could you give me a little slice of how racing fits into, or how ideally taking risks in a personal way? Some people might say you could kill yourself that way. We unfortunately lost Ken Block recently, and I think we all felt that a little bit. Some people think that seems like it goes against the idea of proper risk assessment. Like, why try so hard and take that kind of risk? What is it about that sort of risk taking in your personal life that you feel marries with a lot of this business sense that you've been able to express today?
First, I'll say, business or personal, I love taking risk, but I always want it to be calculated risk. You mentioned that earlier, and you weigh the risk against the reward. Reward, again, it's rarely monetary. The risks you take rarely repay you in a monetary way. There's satisfaction, enjoyment, growth, you name it, right? It's there's so much that comes out of assessing the risk and what comes out of it. And so with motorsports, what I love, first, is the challenge. I love the challenge. I love to be challenged. I am very competitive. So in that regard, I like that I can compete against others. They don't know what's in my head. They can't see my face behind a helmet inside of a car. It's also me against me. You're alone in that car. And there is nothing else, Scott, nothing that you can think of when you're going around a track, in some cases, 3 times the legal speed limit. Um, and you're trying to figure out like the tiniest adjustment that will pick up milliseconds of gain. And all of that, you kind of disappear into the moment. Your mind is processing things very quickly. Your heart rate is up, your adrenaline is flowing. And despite the high adrenaline, the high heart rate, you have to make calculated decisions that have catastrophic effects if you get them wrong. And if you can, first, it clears your brain. When you're done, it's like the best therapy you ever could have had, right? But if you can operate under that kind of stress, pressure, and enjoy it, then when you encounter little things, whether it's behind the wheel or at work or in family life, everything seems to come at you more slowly. And so I think the parallel of taking risk and getting reward is certainly there. But I like the focus. I like the adrenaline. I like the competitive nature, and I also like the game of me against me. Because ultimately, that's all that the growth doesn't come, like whatever you do in life. And I wish you tons of growth and tons of success. But whatever you do in life, it doesn't really affect my sense of self, my ability to achieve, or how I feel day to day. However, when I challenge myself and I overcome those challenges, it shows me what I'm capable of doing. And then that fuels sense of self and encourages me to evaluate further risk, make a decision, and then jump in. And all those things are transferable.
Yeah, it's gains, they certainly aren't siloed in it. It reminds me of a small way in which I like to look at cannabis, because I think that, obviously the classic tropes, the classic stigma says cannabis removes capability, right? Cannabis will leave you with less than you started with. But I've often made the car metaphor of, if you are racing a Ferrari, right, you need the best cooling you can because those cars generate a lot of heat and friction. And cannabis to me is like the best coolant that nature can provide, especially to individuals who might have, even as we mentioned with anxiety before, like a higher sensitivity to being able to interact with their lives. And I don't consider sensitivity ever negative. As an ex-machinist, and I used to do development work for the military, you pay the most for sensitive tools. You pay a bazillion dollars for something that can measure microns without being disturbed. So I often see in a lot of folks when they have the acute abilities to actually be that sensitive to either others or situational awareness, that's one of the best tools. They can tell when the temperature changes like a point of a degree. And in the same way, like in racing, you can tell when your tires are within that same on the edge of actual traction or on the edge of losing it. And to me, it's only when you get to dance there long enough that you can start to relay those things. It does seem to be something that I think in my mind is very attractive from a personal side, but also seems to be one of the best predicators for being able to navigate the cannabis space.
Yeah.
If conflict is a threat, then a lot of people will wait right until it's safe. But if people can calculate risk, it mitigates the idea of, as you mentioned before, panic, perturbations of the mind, which take it out of character. And you're actually able to engage to a deeper level through discomfort than comfort. I remember one quote said, "Comfort will kill your dreams. Discomfort is the only teacher." I think you've embodied that a lot with what you've been able to express today in not only the pursuit of business, but even from a personal side, sort of how it actually impacts the human animal at the end of it all. Because I especially, like you said, in philosophy, it's called the problem of other minds. You never actually know what's going on outside of your head. Our brains are sort of deaf, dumb things in a box, and it just has a couple of wires trying to make sure what's going on outside needs to be flipped upside down and backwards for it to make sense to our brains, right? Like even our vision is constantly being guided differently than it appears by just lenses alone. And I think it really speaks volumes to how unique of a CEO you seem to be. Obviously, your accolades speak for that, but it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to discuss, I think, a lot of that, given one part of it is just structural business. But I think why would somebody go through all of this? You provided us a lot of great insight as to what the human element of that is, as opposed to simply the described success, I think, that we all often hear about first, or majorly out of our social posturings, especially.
Mm-hmm.
So I do appreciate that. Before I let you go, let me ask you, it's not really a fluffy question, but it's sort of a fun one in reference. As we talked about 280E, you did mention that a lot of those costs sort of trickle down to the consumer. Would you say when individuals, obviously, right, people love to complain, and cannabis is full of complaints as any market, is there some level of truth in your mind then to when people say, oh, if not for the illegality, the prices would be a lot more attractive? We'd probably see lowering of prices, like slightly better business models to it. Do you feel that there is a truth to that, given what you said about 280E for the folks who do complain?
Are we saying that if it were federally legal, prices would come down?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it'd be like a friendlier market for the sake of the wallet of the consumer.
Yeah, yes, but I just add the caveat that there needs to be, again, I mentioned earlier my frustration with the lack of logic. So it's one thing if something is legal, it's another if the law around it is illogical. So, yes, I don't think it's a fluffy question at all. I think it's actually a really, we could have an entire dialogue just around that question with a lot of depth and substance. I'll only say yes. I think that legalization would be good. Lower prices are not always bad. The problem with lower prices right now is it comes in the form of price compression because of a disparity in the way licenses are granted. Do you license a lot of cultivators, but you don't license a lot of retailers? You have too many people trying to sell into too few people, and that creates compression. It's almost like either an oversupply or too much choice. And again, I'm not knocking anybody here other than the structure of the law and the way licenses are granted. There isn't, again, without someone on the inside, there isn't a lot of an understanding regarding how you license a cultivator, you license a manufacturer, you license or a processor, a distributor, you license a retailer. How many of these do we need? Where do we need them? How should it work? What's the logistics? That's not happening. Instead, what's happening is they grant licenses, and then the market is dealing with where the chips fall, but it's legal. So if we were to go federally legal, I think that there should just be a bit of logic applied as to how it works. And I'm not saying that any one individual gets something over any other one individual. I'm saying more, let's just use logic to what is the demand and start there. And then how do we want to create the supply so that it's a sustainable model? And they do that with liquor licenses, and they do it with all kinds of other licenses. It just seems a bit too cavalier and undefined as to what that process is. And you watch new states that come online then replicate the same approach to this haphazard granting of licenses. So sorry for the long-winded answer there.
That's a good one. I like it.
I think it's good. Legalization will be good. And even if prices do come down, there's the opportunity to do a lot more. And you more than make up for the margins, and you'll get normalization in the markets, and then the margins come back. And so I'm all for it, and I think it'd be a great thing.
Awesome. Yeah, I know there's some folks out there who really double down, I think, on just the idea, right? I mean, I think we're all pro home grow, especially. I tell folks all the time, cooking burgers at home doesn't kill McDonald's business model. It all works, thankfully.
Yeah.
And I know to some of the folks who kind of lean heavy on that, it's good to know that from the business side, we agree to some extent. Yes, things are very expensive. It's obvious to some extent why, but it's also obvious that I don't always think cheap is better or more expensive is better. The conditions of the market really are going to tell you whether or not it's trending better or worse as a result. But it always requires, as you mentioned before, clear vision.
That last point is exactly the point. It's people should do whatever works for them. They're in aggregate, they create the market, and the market will dictate what happens. We know the demand is there. Mm-hmm. Now we just have to make sure that the structure in which the industry that satisfies that demand has legislation that enables them to thrive.
Yeah, supportive as opposed to restrictive. Correct. Understanding in the same way that, just as you had said before, we've heard some stories come out of certain legal states, children getting into the bags, things like that. I don't think anybody's impressed with those stories. We don't ever want to see that, but hiding things rarely creates responsibility. I think it usually, the more the lights are on, the better we'll see this market. And with that being said, I wanted to thank you for your time, Adam. This has been a great talk today. I really enjoyed being able to discuss cannabis with you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you definitely have a depth of character that I'd say is unique as people go, and especially I think as CEOs go. You probably have run into enough folks who run things oftentimes, as you said, the peanut butter is spread thinly. So it's great to see somebody who has the depth of thought that you're able to access, especially and use it, which I think is doubly. It's one thing to know, it's the other thing to actually put it into action. Now, funding is massively important for the future of cannabis. So if somebody wanted to be interested in finding some further funding with your company, where should they look for you? What's the easiest way to find FundCanna?
The easiest way is on the internet, FundCanna.com, FundCanna.com.
Very easy for anybody out there who was interested after hearing from Adam exactly why he likes to operate the way he does. And obviously, it's noticeable well beyond the cannabis market, as he's been well regarded in the business model. So keep that in mind, folks. And thanks everybody out there for joining me today. We'll be back in another week with more cannabis topics and interviews for you. Big thanks to Adam Stettner and FundCanna for being with us and giving us more funding options in a market with alarmingly few comparatively. Be sure to check us out here at USChamberofCannabis.com, on Instagram with the same name, and also with a YouTube channel that slowly will be getting more video to it as we get a new editor in line. But that's all we have for you today. So until next time, from the professor and from Adam, be sure to grow knowledge and extract truth. Be well, everybody, and thanks for your time.